As a filmmaker, I tell stories. But as an American filmmaker who travels around the world producing films for UN NGO agencies, I want to make sure my films are accurate, respectful, and responsible. My journey to becoming a filmmaker is actually not a typical one. I never went to film school, and to be honest, the idea of becoming a filmmaker never entered my head. When I was young, I was good at a lot of creative things. I played music, I danced, I was a gymnast, I liked to paint and draw. But I also was good at science and math. And I actually knew that I wanted to do good in the world. But at the time, I couldn't figure out how to do all three things in one job. So when it was time for me to get serious about my career, my mother, who was a single mother working 2 jobs, said to me, "I didn't work this hard for you to be a dancer or an artist. I think you need to get a real job." So she probably regretted it because I listened to her advice, and I ended up going to college and getting my master's degree and getting my first real job right in the middle of a war zone. So it was in 1999, and I was working as a humanitarian aid worker in Kosovo and Albania, and I was helping to develop programs for women and children who were in the refugee camps. And I absolutely loved the work that I was doing. There's nothing quite like working on the front lines of an international crisis. But I learned very quickly there was another reason for me being there. I got asked to escort a politician's wife to Albania to do a site visit at the refugee camps. And while we were there, we got invited to a high-level meeting at the US Embassy with about 10 or so women who were running NGOs in Kosovo. And when I looked around the room, I noticed there were 2 women in particular who looked really unhappy to be there. And we went around the room, they said, "You know, we're really unhappy with the journalists who are coming into the refugee camps. They're determined to tell this one particular story." And it was an important story for that time, and it was the story about rape being used as a tool of war. But they said the journalists are coming into the refugee camps saying, "We only have 3 days to tell this story. We need to speak to women who've been raped. Can you raise your hand if you've been raped?" Right. And so that really hit me. And what they said afterward was even more profound. They said, not only is this disrespecting what our people are going through, but they said, at the end of this war, we will no longer be remembered as Kosovar women, but as Kosovar women who've been raped. And I thought, wow. And I went back to New York and I started looking at all the news reports and the PSAs and the films about Kosovo and Albania, and I was realizing that the war and the people that I was experiencing looked nothing like what I was seeing on television. So I decided to become a filmmaker and become a storyteller. And I joke that I didn't go to film school, but I kind of went to film school because I really ditched like 3 years of my life to learn the craft. And after that, I became a self-taught filmmaker where I was producing, directing, writing, shooting, and editing short advocacy films for UN NGO agencies on a variety of global health topics. And again, I really, really loved my job. But I started struggling ethically with the kind of work that I was doing. So my African artist friends would say, for example, "We love when you come to Tanzania, but why is it when you come to Tanzania, you always show the bad parts of Tanzania?" I said, "I hear you, but I work for the United Nations, and I do films about global health topics. So how can I make a film, for example, about obstetric fistula without showing the tremendous physical suffering that women with this childbearing injury go through? How can I make a film about the impact of war on young people without talking about the 17-year-old girl from Colombia whose family was massacred? Like, what is the alternative? Making films about poor people smiling?" In 2010, I got asked to speak at the first Social Good Summit on a panel called The Power of Film. And I had a pretty good idea that they wanted me to talk about the impact that my films about maternal health were making, and I was really honored to do so. But this is the first time I publicly started asking really difficult questions, such as, if film is so powerful, which it is, who has the right to be telling these stories? Am I a Western-educated, American, quarter Chinese woman qualified to tell stories about women in Africa, for example? Is a filmmaker from South Africa who never left their country more qualified than I am, who's traveled around the continent quite a bit, more entitled to tell the story about young people in Liberia? Is an African male filmmaker more qualified than I am to tell women's stories? Is the fact that my films can influence US funding and policy make me credible? So I was really struggling, and I wasn't sure what to do. And it wasn't from a lack of dedication. Like, I was really committed to becoming an ethical storyteller, but I didn't have a lot of guidance. At the time that I started my career, there weren't a lot of people kind of straddling the documentary filmmaking and global health advocacy work. And I realized that there were two big barriers that I was facing. One is that I was becoming very self-conscious about the power dynamic that existed between me and the people whose stories I was telling. So for example, when I was interviewing a man who was dying of AIDS in Malawi, and he kept thanking me over and over and over again for coming all the way from the United States to sit and listen to his story and to be the only American he's ever seen in his village. Well, in my mind, I'm thinking, why are you thanking me? Because the cost of my camera equipment alone could not only fund your medical treatment for a year, but could also probably put your granddaughters through school. So I was really struggling, and the reason why I didn't give up is because I was extremely passionate about what I was doing. I was determined to figure this out because I wanted to be a responsible storyteller in order to, respect my mother who gave up so much for us, and also to pay tribute to my mentor who I lost in an airplane crash in 1998, and also for the people whose stories I was telling. But I didn't want to be seen as sort of the Western filmmaker who would parachute all the way into countries of primarily Black and brown people telling really exploitative stories about their suffering and making a career out of it. I didn't want to perpetuate what is commonly known in my world as poverty porn. Again, like, I didn't want to become the journalist in Kosovo. So the beauty of passion is that I didn't give up because I was passionate about what I was doing. And in my point of view, passion is the driving force behind persistence. And persistence, to me, is what creates real change. So of course, just when I'm ready to throw in the towel and I'm ready to get a real job and have steady income, of course I get an email. And it says, congratulations, you've been nominated to speak at this really big conference with this really big funder. And I thought, this is perfect, this is fantastic. I'll be able to talk about responsible storytelling or narrative justice, about youth empowerment, or about engaging artists in the Sustainable Development Goals. But no, I opened up the email and it said, the theme of this year's conference is big data. I was like, what? What? Who nominated? I knew nothing about big data, but I wanted to do the talk. So I researched everything about big data and creativity, big data and filmmaking, and what kept popping up was Netflix. And Netflix used data in a very interesting way. They collect all sorts of data on their members. They know your age, your gender, where you live. They know how many times you've watched Black Mirror, if you rewatched Orange is the New Black, and they take that information and they analyze it to help them determine their programming. So for example, when House of Cards was being shopped around, they analyzed their data and they noticed anything with Kevin Spacey tended to do well, films directed by David Fincher tended to do well, and political dramas tended to do well. So they were like, we are so convinced this is going to be the perfect program for our members. We outbid HBO, outbid Showtime. They didn't even pilot the series. They dropped $2 million and produced all 24 episodes at once, and we all know how successful House of Cards was. So my theory was that if Netflix could use big data to revolutionize the way they made creative decisions about their programming, then we in the global development community could maybe utilize big data to revolutionize our global health messaging. And that's where my idea for StoryShifter was born. On the front end, I want it to be an entertainment platform for the social good, powered by machine learning and data analytics. What does that look like? It will house creative content on the social good. It will have films, PSAs, poetry, photographs, along with options for viewers to donate to a nonprofit, support an artist, sign a petition, and also support a socially conscious brand. And on the back end, it would collect data and analyze it so that we would have a better idea of what kind of content resonates with which audiences. And my hope is that StoryShifter could become a resource where it will give us tools to have a more sophisticated conversation about poverty porn and maybe how we can tell these stories that are more accurate, respectful, and responsible. Why is big data so important? Well, I've been doing this for a really long time, like really long time. I've made films I've screened films, I curate films, and I have a pretty good idea of what kind of film will resonate with which audience. I can look at a film and be like, okay, that'll work for a donor or policymaker, absolutely won't work with a millennial. Or maybe I can look at a video where they say, we want to promote girls' empowerment in Guatemala, but they victimize the girls in Guatemala. So that film might generate a lot of funding for an NGO, but the girls in Guatemala may not want to see it. And so I plan to use StoryShifter to really change the narrative of how we see global health programming. So I keep talking about changing the narrative, changing the narrative. What does this actually look like? Or why is this so important? Throughout time, changing the narrative has been a very important strategy in a lot of social movements. So for example, Frederick Douglass, one of our most well-known abolitionists, was the most photographed American in the 19th century. He sat for over 160 photographs wearing a suit, a tie, and looking very distinguished. And his idea was to use photography to change the narrative of how America viewed slaves and black people at the time. Another example relates to the Opiate Crisis. There was a controversial photo that was circulated by a police officer in Ohio that showed a couple who was overdosing with a 4-year-old in the back. The police department justified this by saying, we want to show the other side of this horrible drug. But they got a lot of pushback because research shows if you publicly shame somebody with an addiction, which is a medical problem, you're not curing the addiction. You actually might make it worse, right? Dove took one interesting data point, which was that only 2% of women thought they were beautiful, which was shocking to me. But they went ahead and they created a campaign with all sorts of women, different ages, sizes, colors, or whatnot, to extend the definition of what beauty looks like. And then changing the narrative is actually a very personal thing for me. I told you my mother was a single mother and worked 2 jobs, but what I didn't tell you is that she decided in the middle of the night one night when I was 6 years old to leave my very abusive father, and I basically lived my childhood in hiding. She only finished 8th grade, and she was a waitress, so we often lived below the poverty line. And I was in the free school program. So for example, free school program kids had to stand on this side of the cafeteria. Normal kids had to stand on this side of the cafeteria. So guess what I did? I didn't eat. My mother drove a Pinto that all the kids made fun of. It was like the poor people's car. And I was so embarrassed by it that I would ask my mother to drop me off 2 blocks from wherever I was, and I would walk the rest of the way to the event. And I did this because my mother told me at a very young age, she said, despite our circumstances, you can be whoever you want and you can do whatever you want. Because people's circumstances do not predict their potential. And as an adult, we joked that I was like, I must have believed you because I really think I can do anything, like anything. If somebody tells me I can't do something, I just, find another way to do it. So I'll give you an example of how this works in my life. Remember I told you that I had to ditch my dance career because my mother wanted me to get a real job? Well, in 2002, I got to dance or perform with an aerial dance troupe as backup to P. Diddy, Busta Rhymes, Pharrell, and Usher. The Video Music Awards. I told you I didn't go to film school, and I never thought about becoming a filmmaker. In 2009, I won an Emmy Award, which is considered one of the most prestigious awards there are. Thank you. I told you I didn't want to be seen as the poor girl from the uneducated family. So now the United Nations calls me and asks me to produce films and curate artistic performances advocating for girls' empowerment. Thank you. Thank you. So again, one's circumstances do not predict their potential. So I'll end by saying I believe we as a global society can do better in our communications with other people and our communications about other people. So I would challenge you that next time you meet somebody in a less fortunate position, pay attention to the stories that you tell about them. Is it more about their circumstance or is it more about their potential? Because if you believe like I do that little girls, no matter where they are in the rest of the world, are smart and capable and powerful, then please stop telling stories that they're not. Thank you.